Millions were listening. No one heard a second person. That was the mistake. This is a murder hidden inside silence. Prologue. Live. The stream went live at 22:03. No music, no greeting, no words. Just water. At first, it was barely audible, a thin, constant hiss, like rain against glass. Then the microphone adjusted, and the sound deepened, spreading outward into the listener's ears. Water flowed from the faucet into the bathtub in a steady, controlled stream. Not splashing, not rushing, measured, intentional. Millions of people loved that sound. The bathroom was small. That much could be heard. Ceramic tiles reflected the water evenly, creating a soft reverb that suggested clean surfaces and close walls. The space was enclosed, symmetrical. No echo drifted too far. No sound lingered longer than it should. A perfect recording environment. Her breathing entered the mix a few seconds later. Slow, nasal, unforced. Close to the microphone, but not too close. Enough distance to keep it intimate without distortion. Each inhale aligned naturally with the sound of running water, rising slightly, then falling away. Listeners relaxed. This was familiar. The chat scrolled fast, but silently for most viewers. No one expected replies. This wasn't conversation. It was presence. At 22:11, the water pressure changed slightly. Not enough to be noticed consciously. The pitch dropped by a fraction. The hiss became thicker, heavier. A normal fluctuation in an old building, easily ignored. Her breathing adjusted. A half-second delay. Then continued. At 22:14, something shifted. Again, not a sound, an absence. The reverb shortened. The water still flowed, but the room sounded smaller, as if something in the space had absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. No one commented. No one knew how to describe it. Her breathing grew marginally shallower. Not panicked, not strained, just aware. Listeners leaned closer to their headphones without realizing why. The faucet continued, steady, faithful, uninterested. At 22:16, her inhale did not fully arrive. There was a pause, too long to be intentional, too short to register as alarm. Then another breath followed, quieter, closer, as if she had leaned forward, or something had leaned toward her. The water masked everything. That was the point of ASMR. The sound filled the auditory field so completely that nothing else mattered. Nothing sharp could intrude. Nothing sudden could exist. Violence did not belong here. At 22:17, her breathing changed again. A micro-catch. The kind that happens when someone realizes something is wrong but hasn't yet named it. The water continued. The room did not echo the same way anymore. Then it happened. Not a scream, not a gasp, not a struggle. Just the end of breath. The last inhale never completed. There was no exhale to follow. The water kept running. The microphone kept listening. For 26 seconds, the stream continued exactly as before. Water, empty space, no breath. Some listeners assumed it was a loop. Some assumed it was intentional. Some felt uncomfortable but stayed anyway. At 22:18, the stream ended. No sign-off, no fade, just silence. The police would later describe the bathroom as immaculate. The door was locked from the inside. The window was barred. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. An accident, they said. A slip, a fainting episode, water inhalation. Edward Hale listened to the recording at 03:42 the following morning. He did not watch the video. He closed his eyes. He listened to the water, the breathing, the room. And then he opened his notebook. Because the room had changed, and rooms, Edward knew, only changed when someone else was inside them. Book 13, The Silent Listener. Chapter 1, A Perfect Silence. The police liked the bathroom. Bathrooms were honest rooms, small, predictable, designed for routine, not deception. There were only so many ways a person could die in one, and most of them were well documented. Edward Hale stood just inside the doorway while the forensic team finished their work. White tiles, glass shower screen, bathtub half filled with lukewarm water. Nothing out of place. That was the problem. The door told its story quickly. The latch was intact, no scratches, no pressure marks. It could only be locked from the inside, the kind of detail that allowed investigators to relax. Locked room, the lead detective said, not proudly, but with relief. No forced entry. Edward nodded, but did not respond. He had learned that relief often arrived too early. The window was next. Small, high, reinforced with metal bars embedded into the frame. No signs of tampering, no fresh tool marks, no distortion in the metal. Even if someone wanted to get in, they couldn't. Edward leaned closer. Couldn't, he repeated softly. The body lay in the tub, her head tilted slightly to one side, dark hair floating just beneath the surface of the water. The position was natural, too natural, the kind of posture the body assumed when it was no longer fighting. No visible bruises, no cuts, no defensive wounds. The medical examiner spoke quietly, efficiently. Likely drowning, she said. Secondary factors possible. Panic, fainting, inhalation. Toxicology pending. Edward listened. And the stream, he asked. The examiner shrugged. Irrelevant, she said. Audio doesn't show distress. Edward wrote the word down anyway. Irrelevant. The equipment had already been cataloged. A condenser microphone mounted near the edge of the tub. Shock mount intact, no water damage. Audio interface powered down cleanly when the stream ended. No interruptions, no power surge, no sudden impact. The stream had stopped manually or by software timeout. Edward noted the timestamps. They played the recording again for the room. The water filled the speakers. Soft, controlled, comforting. The breathing came and went. Even, unalarmed, human. The recording ended exactly where everyone remembered it ended.
The silence afterward felt final, satisfied. This is why people liked her, the detective said. Safe content, calming, no drama. Edward nodded. And that's why this feels wrong, he replied. The detective frowned. You hear something we don't? Edward shook his head. I hear what you do, he said. That's the issue. Edward asked to listen again, alone. They left him in the hallway with a portable recorder and headphones. The apartment was quiet. Neighbors had been told to stay inside. Someone's television murmured distantly through a wall. Edward closed his eyes. He let the water fill his ears. The first thing he noticed was how perfect it was. The sound of water was consistent. No splashing, no irregular turbulence. The faucet angle had not changed. The flow rate stayed within a narrow band. That required attention. People relaxed did not maintain consistency. People performing did. The breathing entered again. Edward counted silently. Inhale, pause, exhale. The rhythm was natural, but precise, almost rehearsed. Edward frowned slightly. At the point where the police believed she fainted, Edward did not hear chaos. He heard control persist for too long. A body losing consciousness did not maintain breathing patterns. They broke, they stumbled, they told the truth. Edward replayed the last minute 3 times, then a 4th. He stopped the recording and removed the headphones. The hallway felt larger. He returned to the bathroom and stood where the microphone had been positioned. He closed the door. The room became intimate instantly. Edward inhaled. The tiles reflected sound cleanly. The bathtub added a low-frequency bloom. The ceiling returned a subtle echo, barely noticeable unless one was listening for it. Edward shifted his weight. The sound changed. He took 1 step back. The sound changed again. Edward opened his eyes. He returned to the hallway and wrote a single sentence in his notebook. Silence is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of interference.
The police had built their case on what they did not hear. Edward understood that instinct, but sound did not disappear when people did.
It changed shape. Edward looked at the closed bathroom door once more. There was no noise, the detective said again, almost defensively. Edward nodded. Yes, he said, that's what makes it impossible. Chapter 2. What Water Hides. Edward Hale began with the faucet. Not the handle, not the pipe, the sound. Water was honest about one thing only. It filled space. It occupied frequencies. It pressed outward, smoothing sharp edges and erasing fine detail. That was why people found it calming, and that was why it was dangerous. Edward replayed the first minute again. The flow was laminar, smooth, uninterrupted. No splatter, no erratic turbulence. The stream struck the same point in the tub with almost surgical consistency. This was not how people behaved when they relaxed. This was how they behaved when they set a condition. Edward wrote in his notebook, water chosen, water positioned. He reconstructed the setup. The microphone was angled slightly downward, closer to the tub than to the walls. Its pickup pattern favored low-frequency wash over high-frequency transients. In simple terms, it loved water and ignored footsteps. Edward closed his eyes and imagined the room. A small bathroom, hard surfaces, predictable reflections. Now add water. The reflections collapsed. Sound that would normally bounce, fabric brushing skin, a foot shifting on tile, was absorbed, masked, dissolved into the constant hiss. Edward nodded. Water didn't silence a room, it replaced it. Edward performed a test. He stood in the bathroom again, turned the faucet to match the recorded intensity, and placed a recorder where the microphone had been. He moved, slowly, deliberately. He shifted his weight, raised a heel, let his socks slide across tile. Nothing registered. He stopped the water. The room returned instantly. Edward smiled faintly. Context restored. Edward listened to the recording for micro-variations. At 2211, the pressure changed, not a drop, an adjustment, the kind that happened when someone fine-tuned the masking field. The water's pitch thickened, spreading downward into frequencies that swallowed movement. Edward wrote, someone increased the curtain. He examined the drain. It was clean, wide, designed to pull water down without gurgle, no vocalizing pipe, no rhythmic suction. The kind of drain that removed sound as efficiently as it removed liquid. Edward traced the edge with his finger. Chosen, he said quietly. Edward returned to the breath. Breathing was the only human sound left, and it was carefully placed, close enough to feel intimate, far enough to avoid popping. The microphone loved it. Edward noticed the alignment. When the water thickened, the breathing moved closer to the mic. Not by much, just enough to maintain dominance in the mix. Edward underlined the implication. Someone managed levels in real time. Edward paused at 2214. This was where the room changed, not audibly to most listeners, not as an event, as a reduction. The reverb shortened. The tail of the water hiss died sooner than before. The room sounded smaller. Edward stood very still. Rooms only shrank when something absorbed sound. Curtains, clothing, bodies. Edward wrote. An absorber entered the field. Edward tested the theory. He brought a heavy towel into the bathroom, hung it just at a frame where the camera wouldn't see it, and ran the faucet again. He recorded the sound. The reverb shortened. The room shrank. Exactly the same way. Edward closed the notebook. Edward listened again to the final breaths. The micro-catch, the tiny hitch that preceded the end, was not panic. Panic announced itself. This was recognition. She had sensed a change she could not see, a shift in pressure, a presence without sound. Edward wrote. Water hit movement. The room betrayed it. Edward returned to the hallway where the officers waited. The water wasn't background, he said. It was the weapon. They stared at him. Water can't kill without noise, one said. Edward shook his head. Water kills by removing information, he replied. Edward summarized the chapter in one sentence he had learned to trust. If you want to move unseen, he said, you don't eliminate sound. He paused. You drown it. Chapter 3. The Listener. Edward Hale did not begin with suspects. He began with listeners. ASMR audiences like to describe themselves as passive. They used words like relaxing, background, comfort. They insisted they were not really watching,
just letting sound exist near them while they slept, worked, or stared at screens filled with something else. Edward had never believed that. Listening, he knew, was an intimate act, more intimate than watching. You could look without attention. You could not listen without proximity. He sat in front of the streamer's archived page while the apartment was still sealed. The video thumbnail showed a familiar image, a softly lit bathroom, steam hazing the mirror, the edge of the bathtub visible at the frame's bottom. Nothing provocative, nothing alarming. Safe. Edward scrolled. Millions of followers, hundreds of archived streams, thousands of comments repeating the same phrases. Your breathing helps me sleep. I love how close it feels. It's like you're right here. Edward read without judgment. He was looking for deviation. The donation logs told a quieter story. Most viewers donated small, consistent amounts, ritual contributions, a way of thanking without expectation. But there were others. One username appeared repeatedly. Not the largest donor, not the loudest, just persistent. Edward wrote the name down. He read the private messages next. The platform had flagged nothing. No threats, no explicit fixation. Everything stayed just inside acceptable boundaries. That was the point. You don't know me, but I listen every night. Your breathing changed yesterday. Were you okay? I like when you're closer to the mic. Edward paused. That last one appeared 3 times. He checked the dates. They corresponded with moments when she adjusted her setup slightly. Changes subtle enough that most listeners would not consciously register them. But someone had. Edward wrote, "He doesn't just listen, he monitors." Edward cross-referenced the messages with Stream Analytics. The user was always present, not just during live broadcasts, but during replays at odd hours, consistently early, consistently late. He listened more than most people slept. Edward leaned back. This was not obsession. This was pattern recognition. Edward requested access to the raw audio archive, not the compressed stream, not the cleaned version, the original files. He listened to several past streams in sequence: water, breathing, silence. Then he noticed something he hadn't expected. Her breathing changed when she thought no one was watching. Streams recorded late at night with fewer viewers were looser, less controlled. The microphone placement varied slightly. The water flow was less precise. Edward nodded. She adjusted her behavior based on perceived audience, which meant someone else could do the same. Edward returned to the messages. One stood out now. "I'll stay quiet, I promise." Edward closed his eyes. Silence was never a promise made to someone else. It was a promise made to yourself. Edward asked the platform for geographic metadata. The request took time. When it arrived, Edward did not smile. The listener lived close. Not next door, not in the building, close enough to walk. Edward reconstructed the final stream from the listener's perspective. He knew the routine. He knew the setup. He knew when she leaned forward. He knew when the water thickened. Most importantly, he knew where the microphone was not listening. Edward wrote, "Familiarity creates confidence." Edward examined the chat again. During the final stream, the listener did not type. Not once. He did not donate. He did not announce presence. Edward wrote another line. The most attentive listener becomes silent when listening isn't enough. Edward stood in the bathroom again, imagining someone else's attention layered over the space. Someone who knew the sound of the room better than the sight of it. someone who understood where the microphone's world ended and where reality continued. Edward had worked cases like this before. People who loved routines did not want disruption. They wanted access. Edward closed the archive and wrote his conclusion. The killer had not arrived with violence. He had arrived with knowledge. He had moved in silence because silence had been rehearsed for months. Edward wrote the final line of the chapter slowly. The most dangerous listeners are the ones who learn the room before they enter it. Chapter 4. The Sound That Shouldn't Change. Edward Hale listened to the recording again, this time without emotion. Emotion blurred thresholds. He needed edges. He marked 3 segments and looped them po krugu. Rani fragment, когда всё нормально, средний, где никто ничего не слышит, и финальный, где дыхание исчезает. Edward did not listen for new sounds. He listened for consistency. Water was supposed to be stable. Not perfectly, nothing physical ever was, but stable enough that deviations followed rules. Pressure changes created predictable shifts. Faucet angle changes altered spectral balance. Room temperature affected resonance. Edward mapped all of it. And then he found the problem. At 22:14:06, the water continued exactly as before. Same pressure, same impact point, same harmonic spread. But the room did not. The decay time shortened by a measurable fraction, not enough for the ear to call it echo loss, but enough for the brain to register constriction. Edward leaned forward. Rooms did not decide to become smaller. They were made smaller. Edward isolated the frequencies. The high end remained untouched. The hiss stayed airy and intact. What changed lived lower, where bodies mattered, where soft materials absorbed energy instead of reflecting it. Edward wrote a single word: mass. He tested the hypothesis again. He loaded the early segment and added a simulated absorber into the acoustic model, human-sized, clothed, positioned just outside the microphone's primary pickup pattern. The curve matched, not approximately, precisely. Edward closed his eyes. This was the sound that should not change. The water had not been adjusted, the faucet had not moved, the drain had not vocalized. Only one variable could explain the shift. Someone had entered the room, quietly, deliberately. Edward replayed the moment where her breathing hitched. That micro-catch was not fear. Fear spiked. This was calculation. She had noticed the same thing he had, without knowing how to describe it. The room felt closer. The sound pressed in. The space no longer behaved as it should. Edward wrote. She sensed interference. Edward stood in the bathroom again and repeated the test. He ran the water to match the recording. He placed the microphone. He listened. Then he stepped behind the shower curtain, careful to stay out of the mic's primary field pattern. The room shrank. Edward stepped back out. The room returned. He nodded once. Edward checked the timestamps. The acoustic change occurred before any physiological distress, before any loss of control, before the end of breath, which meant it was not a result of the death. It was a cause. He returned to the police with a single sentence. "The sound proves someone else was in the room," Edward said. They shook their heads. "There's nothing on the recording," one officer replied. Edward nodded. "Exactly," he said. "Nothing new." Edward explained it carefully. "If I close a door, you hear it," he said. "If I move a chair, you hear it. But if I stand still in the wrong place, you don't hear me." They stared. "You hear the room change," Edward continued, "and rooms only change when mass enters them." Edward played the clip again, this time overlaying a visual graph. Here, Before, here, after. The line dipped. No spike, no event, just absorption. Edward closed his notebook. The locked door no longer mattered. The barred window was irrelevant. The lack of noise was no longer reassuring. The room itself had testified. Edward ended the chapter with the conclusion that sealed the case. The killer had not needed to speak. He had not needed to move quickly. He had not needed to make a sound. He had only needed to stand where the microphone could not hear him. Edward wrote the final line with care. The sound didn't reveal the killer. It revealed the space he occupied. Chapter 5. Inside the Quiet. Edward Hale began with where the killer stood. Not who he was, not why he came, where. The bathroom was smaller than it felt on camera. That was intentional. ASMR thrived on proximity, but not on claustrophobia. The illusion of space mattered. Edward measured it again, step by step, heel to tile, counting the distances that microphones turned elastic. The microphone was mounted low, angled toward the tub, its pickup pattern shaped like a shallow cone. It listened to water first, breath second, and the room last. Everything else existed at the margins. Edward marked those margins. He drew an invisible arc from the mic's null point to the shower curtain rail. The curtain itself was heavy, textured, designed to absorb splash. When drawn fully, it did more than block sight. It ate sound. Edward pulled it halfway and turned on the faucet to match the recording. The room narrowed, the decay shortened, the water remained faithful. He stepped behind the curtain. Nothing registered. Edward nodded. The latch was next. He examined it again, slower this time, not for damage, for habit. Bathroom latches were simple, predictable. People used them the same way every time. Close the door, slide the bolt, forget about it. They did not recheck. Edward closed the door and slid the bolt. Then he pushed gently. The door did not open. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Edward reached up and tapped the door frame. Hollow. The window told the same story. Bars embedded deep into masonry. No flex, no fresh marks, no way in. Which meant the killer had not come through the door or the window. He had come through routine. Edward reconstructed the night without embellishment. She prepared the stream. She set the mic. She adjusted the water. She closed the door and latched it, automatically, without thought. She drew the shower curtain partly closed to keep splash from the microphone. She began breathing. The killer arrived earlier, not during the stream, before it. He entered the apartment when apartments were still permeable, during delivery windows, maintenance hours, moments when no one counted entry as intrusion. He knew those windows. He listened to her schedule. He knew when she prepared. He waited. Edward stood where the killer would have stood, behind the curtain, one foot angled outward to distribute weight, hands relaxed, not braced. Breathing slowed. Stillness rehearsed. Edward timed it. A human could stand like this for minutes without fatigue if they expected silence. He tested movement. A slow shift of weight registered nothing. A careful adjustment of fingers brushed fabric without sound. The curtain absorbed it. The water erased what remained. Edward noted the crucial detail. The killer did not approach her from behind the mic. He approached the space. When the room shrank at 22:14, it was not because he moved. It was because he stopped. He had entered the sound field fully and then became still. Edward wrote, "Motion creates noise. Presence changes acoustics. The moment of death was not violent. It was efficient." Edward replayed the end again. The micro-catch in her breath aligned with a pressure change that did not belong to panic. It belonged to contact, brief, precise, applied where the body responded without thrashing. A hand, a forearm, weight leveraged against the tub edge. No struggle, no splashing, no sounds the water could not swallow. Edward turned off the faucet. The room returned to its honest size. He looked at the latch again. "It worked," he said quietly. "Locks always did what they were designed to do. They kept people out. They did nothing about those already inside." The arrest came without spectacle. The listener confessed in fragments, not to the act, but to the listening, to the learning, to the belief that he knew the room better than she did. "I never made a sound," he said, confused, almost offended. Edward nodded. "You didn't need to," he replied. Edward closed the case with a final reconstruction for the record. The door was locked, the window was barred, the room was silent, because silence had been engineered. Edward wrote the last line of the chapter and set his pen down. The killer didn't defeat the lock. He defeated the idea that sound equals presence. Epilogue. Still listening. The stream remained online. The platform did not remove it immediately. There were procedures, reviews, appeals. Automated systems flagged a video, then unflagged it, uncertain how to classify a recording where nothing visibly happened. No violence, no screams, no intruder. Just water and breath. And then, neither. Edward Hale listened to the final 30 seconds one last time. Not to the end of breath, to what followed. The water continued with professional indifference, filling the space where a person had been. The microphone kept recording faithfully, loyal to input, not meaning. For 26 seconds, the room existed without her, and thousands of people stayed. The comments beneath the archived stream changed slowly. At first, confusion. Is this part of the video? Why did it end like that? I thought it was a loop. Then, discomfort. Something feels wrong here. I can't explain it, but I don't like it. And finally, silence. People stopped commenting, but the views kept climbing. The apartment was cleaned. The bathroom returned to being a bathroom. Tiles scrubbed, faucet replaced, shower curtain discarded. The latch remained the same. Locks, Edward knew, were rarely the problem. The killer was charged. The headlines were cautious. ASMR streamer death ruled homicide. Audio analysis key to investigation. Most articles focused on obsession, on fandoms, on online danger. Edward read none of them. They were looking at people. The case had never been about people. Edward closed his notebook in the quiet of his office and sat without sound for a while. Listening changed you. Once you learned how much could happen without noise, you never trusted silence the same way again. Somewhere, someone pressed play on the recording again. Headphones on, lights off, eyes closed. They came for calm. They stayed for something else. Edward wrote the final line of the case and did not underline it. Silence is not empty. It's just selective. He closed the notebook. Outside, water ran somewhere in another apartment behind another locked door, filling another room with sound that meant safety. Edward knew better. She wasn't killed loudly. She was killed carefully. If you want more detective stories where crimes hide inside everyday systems, subscribe to the channel. The next case will sound harmless, too.